Welcome to Two Bees in a Pod. I am Bilola.
And I am B. Leonga, and this is a podcast about immigrant experiences in the U.S., sharing our perspectives on various topics,
Including straddling cultures, fitting in, staying connected, learning and unlearning the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Welcome to this week's episode. We have a special guest with us today to talk about mental health. We have Anim Aweh, and we'll allow her to introduce herself in a little bit. But Anim, we always start our episodes with an icebreaker. And I said before we got on the air that you wouldn't appreciate this, but I just wanted to be petty, right? So the icebreaker, the question is, name a person who needs therapy. Now, I know that we all need therapy, but in the petty sense, name a person who needs therapy.
To keep it relevant in terms of the space, I'm gonna say Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon.
Bruh.
The long-time ruling president of Cameroon.
It's too late for
I was gonna say it's too late.
Too late?
He's not
Well,
he's not
The
lucid.
future.
Exactly.
He could have benefited surely in the past.
True.
True that. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Bilola?
Mine is a group.
Uh-oh.
Immigrants who support racist candidates and policies. They need to talk to somebody because who hurt you?
It's a good one.
That's true. And that's not even like a petty statement. It's real. Because there's something going on there, right? There's some internalized battle that needs to be explored.
Address. Yeah. That's a good one.
Men, that's my own right. Every man that I've ever met in my life, that's short and simple.
Short and sweet.
But that's not even petty. That's just factual though.
It's real.
Y'all need it, and y'all are the most resistant. So hopefully by the end of this episode, at least some people will be convinced to go to therapy. So why are we talking about therapy? Because Anim is here to join us on that, lend her expertise on that subject. She's a licensed mental health therapist and a certified clinical health educator. She is the co-founder of Aweh Support, which provides mental health therapy as well as other support services like career coaching, financial literacy, health education, and immigrant support. So Anim, please, well, first of all, thank you for joining us. And then can you, that's a snippet of, that I took obviously from your website, but there's so much more that we want to learn about you. So can you just give us a brief background of yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, to a Cameroonian father and a Haitian mother. Everyone always asks me how they met. I don't know. I never really asked. I'm a twin. I'm the youngest of my twin sister and I, 2 minutes younger. I always thought it was 4. Again, another story that's been told. And so I became a therapist on accident, right? I think like most African families or immigrant families, the path was to go down towards medicine, and I attempted and it didn't work out, and I just slipped up and found this field, and I've been here now for like 16 years. And the reason why we created Aweh Support, and by we I mean my sister and I, is because we wanted to create what we didn't have in our communities. We wanted to increase access to care and services for people that look like us, right? We know how hard it is to get quality services. We know how hard it is to get culturally competent services. So that's why we created, or that was the mission around it. And then, to add on the immigration piece, so part of what we do is we work alongside attorneys to provide mental health evaluations for individuals seeking asylum status, for individuals petitioning under VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women's Act, which men could also qualify for. We know folks are, as first generation Americans, I just feel like it was my due diligence to somehow leverage my skill set and my knowledge to try to give back in a meaningful way. And so we know things are happening throughout the world, really. And, people are flocking over here for opportunities or to flee persecution or various situations across the world. And so I felt like that was part of that needed to be embedded into what we were doing. So I do a few things, and I try to keep myself busy.
That you sound very busy. And so you co-founded I Would Support. Is that your twin? Your
Yeah,
co-founder?
my twin sister is my co-founder. So she mans the career services portion. So she's an HR professional. Again, she was supposed to go the law school route. It didn't work out. She landed in tech, and she's been coach supporting people get into really high paying skilled roles. And so we leverage her skill set again and bring it back to the business. It's all about how we can lift others as we climb, right? Because we had so many opportunities coming up in Boston. So many people looked out for us. And so we needed to figure out a way how we could do the same for others and provide a sort of holistic model and a sort of one-stop shop model, if you will, for the services.
I love that. So when you look back on your journey, right, your education, setting up your practice, and what were some of the challenges that, when you look back, what were some of the challenges that you faced? And following that, what advice would you give somebody who was taking a
Yeah.
similar path?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges on this path or finding myself on this path was that I went to a predominantly white institution, and unfortunately I had some really bad advisors that really spoke, I came from a family that spoke life into me, that told my dad always told me like there's nothing you can't do, anything you put your mind to, it's yours. And then I got confronted with these white advisors that would tell me, "Oh, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough," and so it made me doubt myself. It made me give up on my dreams, and so that was a sort of turning or pivotal moment on my path. And even like getting licensed as a mental health therapist, a lot of people don't actually realize like it's quite the journey. And so postgraduate school, you have to complete up to 3,300 clinical hours. On top of that, you must complete 100 clinical supervision hours, actually 120 clinical supervision hours. Then you have to petition the board to be able to sit for the exam, then pay the money. And so you go through all that. I failed my exam twice. The first time I failed by 4 points. The second time I failed by one point, and then came back and finally passed it on the third try. So like there were a lot of obstacles within that. And so a lot of that, during that downtime was like being intentional about keeping myself busy and keeping myself positive despite the obstacles, and honestly managing my own mental health around it, right? Finally going to seek out therapy, which it wasn't historically normalized in my family, right? That's not something we talked about. And so navigating my path around that. And so many obstacles came across my way, by the grace of God and just perseverance. Like none of, I didn't allow any of that to stop me from being successful.
That's awesome. So you mentioned that like the stereotypical expectation in immigrant families is to like
Yeah.
doctor, lawyer, engineer. When
That's it.
you decided to go on this path, like were your family, were they surprised? Were they supportive? Were they questioning?
They were surprised. My dad, even till this day, he calls me. He's just like, "It's not too late to go to med school. It's not too late. Like, you already work at the hospital alongside doctors. Like, you already have that experience." But I think they look back and see what I've been able to accomplish, and they find solace in that. And, I remember one time my mom was saying, like, "Well, at least you get to work alongside doctors and you work in hospital. So I guess it's okay." But it took a lot of having to, it put a chip on my shoulder, right? Because I had to prove to them like this was a worthy cause. This was something that was viable. This is something that I could stay my life assistant and create a comfortable life for myself. And so now that they see that I'm comfortable, I'm established, like things are working, they're just like, okay, I guess this is okay.
Yeah. I mean, that
Yeah.
kind of career expectation, it comes from a good place, right? Like you said, it's from
Yeah,
them wanting you to be comfortable and like live a good life.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So looking back, like what advice would you give your younger self or somebody in that position?
Yeah, I would say that you can't allow people to speak fear or project their negative perceptions of themselves or whatever they're going through onto you. And so I gave that example earlier about how my college, so to give detail, I was a bio major coming into undergrad, right? Because I was going to do the pre-med, go to med school like my parents had wanted me to. And so I had gotten a C in biology, and the advisor was just like, oh, you're not cut out for this. You're not cut out for med school. You're never going to make it. You're not cut out for a C. It's just not going to do it. And so I accepted her reality, or I accepted those truths as my own. And that really messed me up. And so for me, don't allow anybody to speak fear into what you have or what you're envisioning for yourself. But secondly, like embracing change and learning how to pivot is really important. It's a lifelong skill set. If you know how to pivot, if you can be fluid and kind of just go with it, like that's a really helpful skill set to just navigate life, right? Sometimes curveballs are thrown at you. And I think that could be said about mental health, right? Sometimes curveballs are thrown at us, life happens. Ultimately, it's all about the tools and skills that you have to navigate these issues when confronted. So I would say persevere, keep pushing through, but also like being mindful of your mental health, being mindful of your health. Those type of things are really important in terms of like this ongoing journey of life.
Agree. So you mentioned that, you went into this space because there is a need, right, in immigrant communities. What are the challenges, faced by immigrants in getting mental health, whether that's the resources or just the general attitudes in the community?
I think the general attitude is that it's a couple of things. I think it's still heavily stigmatized, right? I think when we think about mental health from our like sort of immigrant communities, I think it's seen as a shortcoming, right? Or like some people equate it to not being or not having a strong enough relationship with God. And so therefore God is punishing you. And so it kind of creates this sort of negative connotation that continues to persist. And so as a result, people ignore it, people dismiss it, people don't realize that it's something that's truly impacting them. And so unfortunately, what I see happening is that a lot of people don't get the care that they need. A lot of people end up, living through trauma day in and day out. And ultimately what happens with that is that wears down on your immune system, which then causes more complications in terms of your physical health, because that's just how the alignment between that physical and mental health piece. And so when we continue to ignore those problems, more issues persist. And so I don't think people are making the connection. And it's unfortunate because so many people are struggling in silence. So many people don't feel like they can ask for help, because asking for help is sort of seen as a weakness. And I see that particularly a lot in our communities, and it's unfortunate, right? And so until the doctor in the white coat says it, they can't accept it as a reality. They can't accept it as a truth. And so it really impacts us both on a physical and mental level, and it really creates this intergenerational trauma, if you so to speak, right? Where that sort of gets passed down, these behaviors, these attitudes, and those type of things can keep a family stuck, and it can keep us in some serious ruts that will ultimately continue to repeat these cycles, right, until we address them. And it's just an unfortunate common concern that I see within the families. And when you look at family dynamics, or you look at certain people, certain cultures, you kind of just see it continue to replay itself out.
Agreed. So let me ask like an icebreaker part 2, right? And this is going to
Go
be
for
like
it.
a serious one. So
Okay.
when did you first go to therapy, and what made you realize that you needed that
Yeah.
that was part of your healthcare, essentially?
Yeah. So I was in grad school. It was my first year grad school. I'm gonna be real vulnerable. I was with this guy. I shouldn't have been with him, and I found out he was cheating on me, and then I just went into like a depressive spiral. And also I noticed that like I was thinking about dying. Like I wanted to like just die. Like I just wanted the pain to go away. And so that's when I realized one of my professors, I came into class crying one night, and she's just like, you got to take care of yourself. And so that's when they motivated me to go into therapy. There's just like every therapist needs their own therapist, and you're a therapist in training. You got to do the work for yourself, or you're no good to your clients. And so so my grad school, that was 2011. That's the first time I went to therapy. And interesting enough, I was talking to my college roommate not too long ago, and she was telling me that she was going to therapy. I'm like, girl, you were going to therapy in college? Like where? Like I didn't even know like that was a thing. And she was just like, yeah, I used to go up to the student health center, and I'm just like, that wow. And it's so yeah, for me, it was first time in graduate school, right? When I'm studying to be a therapist, that was the first time I got therapy.
Bilal, what about you?
Maybe 2 years ago. I'm
And what was
I,
the push?
my friend died suddenly,
Mm.
and it just felt like everything that had been piling up on that at that point, like I felt like I was suffocating. Like, you know, you feel the tightness in your chest just like nonstop. And my
Yeah.
friend
Mm-hmm.
had been advocating for me to get a therapist for a while, but I think when my friend passed away, that was the push I needed.
Yeah, so Anim, like you, and I really hate to admit it that it was a
Yeah.
relationship with a man that sent me to therapy, but overall, I mean, it was for the greater good, right? So it
Yeah.
was a very toxic relationship. We were just two toxic people who did not need to be together.
Yeah.
So I started going, and then probably like 6 months after, like we ended up breaking up.
Yeah.
But I stayed because I had tried to like bring him to the therapy
Yeah.
sessions because I was initially going kind of like with the goal of, oh, I'm gonna like fix our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, like he went like one time and then
Yeah.
like
At
didn't
least it
want to go
worked.
again. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then my therapist one day he told me, he was like, look, the only reason I invited him, I asked you to bring him, was so that I could learn more about you. Like he told me like his goal was never to fix our relationship. So yeah, I just kept going. I kept seeing him obviously after the relationship ended for
Mm-hmm.
years and years. Yeah. So that was my initial push, but then obviously I saw how it helped me and I kept going.
Oh, I literally so I moved from Boston to California thinking that would help, still didn't do it. And so I try to do all these things, and I think that's what happens with people, right? We try to do all these things. We go shopping to fill the void, or we buy all these things or whatever it is that we think is going to do to fill the void or like resolve that issue, and none of it really begins to penetrate even the surface. And when I sat down and I met with that therapist and she held me accountable, she made me come in each week. She motivated me even when I didn't want to or had the energy. Like she was she was adamant about like me following through. That's when the breakthroughs happen, right? And like I remember one time in one session, she just said flat out, "That man does not love you." And I'm just like,
Oh,
and that was the first time I heard that, right? None of my friends dare said anything like that. I would never tell my parents about that because the other thing was like he was in prison, which is a whole nother story. So like I couldn't tell my parents, and so I think, and again, that speaks to why it's so important to see a therapist versus a friend, right? Our
mm-hmm.
friends are gonna say things that pacify us, that make us feel good because they love us, they support us, and so you're not necessarily gonna hear those hard truths. And so my therapist, she called it out just like that, and like it's like it felt like my heart sunk, but like that's what I needed to hear. And so it's sometimes I always say to my clients, therapy can be about us facing the hard truths, right? Like you're giving me the story, I'm painting this portrait, and I'm forcing you to look at this portrait, right? And it makes you uncomfortable at times, but like you're gonna have to decide like what are the things you want to change to get to this place that you want to be. And so that's what she was able to do for me. So that I have a personal story around therapy and how amazing and powerful it can be on top of being a therapist. So like that's why I encourage so many people to like get that support that they need.
There were times where like, man, I did not want to go back and see that man. And then he would give me homework. It's like, bruh. Yeah. So I mean, like you mentioned, right? It is a stigma in immigrant communities. So how do you navigate that and kind of try to break down those barriers or the resistance that people have?
Yeah, so I think it's gonna be individualized, but sometimes I have to validate that people are allowed to feel and have emotions around certain things. Actually, take it a step backwards, right? Helping people identify emotions. I think even in our big ages, sometimes we still aren't able to identify certain emotions or validate certain emotions because we were never given the language around it. We were never given the experience to like express that. And so sometimes it's starting from I would say fundamental steps in that regards, but also giving people assuring safety because safety is a big part of the therapy journey. And what I mean by that is just like I work with a number of like immigrant women like from Nigeria, like Cameroon. Like I've talked to people all over the world who are victims of sexual assault, victims of, sexual aggression. And so safety, they never experience that. So if I can provide that safe element and that safe space for them to sort of even talk about some of these things, right? When trauma happens, it's hard to recall, it's hard to report some of the intricacies around that. And so to be able to provide a safe space where somebody can like be grounded and kind of just open up is paramount, is monumental. A lot of women, unfortunately, when we think about a lot of women back home, or we think a lot about a women in other countries, they don't have that. And so that's why safety is so important for me, and establishing that safety and trust in my space for my clients is a really big part of that. And that can help peel back the layers and ultimately help people start to begin to make that connection. And then we go into like psychoeducation, right? Like what trauma is, everything they experience, putting a name on it sometimes, like making it help. And so it's work, but I think safety is the biggest thing for a lot of people, and needing that, where and non-judgmental, right? When we think about some of our families, there's a lot of judgment, there's a lot of shame. And so reassuring people that I'm not here to judge you, right? Like again, I'm here to help you see this painting we put together, and like what we need to change or what's not working. And so those are the biggest things that I see for the immigrant communities in therapy, and helping them progress in therapy, not just be in therapy, but helps them progress.
Mhm.
I have a follow-up question on that because
Yeah.
actually it's two parts, right? In a lot of immigrant communities, when people are struggling with their mental health, for religious family or people who are religious, it's
Mhm.
like pray or talk to your pastor, where your pastor is not
Correct.
necessarily trained to give you the kind of help that you need. How do you handle some of those situations? 'Cause I think that it could be particularly difficult when you're trying to get somebody to talk to a licensed professional, and
Mhm.
they have like internal conflict that they should be praying or they should talk to their pastor instead.
Yeah, well, I think for folks who are like super religious, I'm okay with them bringing that into the space, but also leveraging their relationship with God and like helping them understand how, God doesn't want suffering, right? And so, in terms of like, if they're anxious or they're depressed, like how we can use tools around like cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness. A part of mindfulness can be prayer, right? Mindfulness doesn't just have to be yoga or going for a walk. They can leverage that, their faith into a lot of this work that we're doing. And so even with that, like I would say if somebody is like super religious, then you can find a Christian counselor. You can find a Christian based therapist that will allow you to bring all those identities, if you will, into the space and kind of use that in your healing journey. And so it doesn't have to be one or the other. And so in terms of like the pastor stepping in, like I try to like have conversations and like facilitate workshops in like churches or local organizations to kind of help see the distinctions on like who someone should go to in terms of a mental health crisis or mental health issues. Like pastors can be a part of the supportive community, but they aren't the providers. So helping people understand the designated roles within the sort of larger community context in terms of like accessing mental health and quality mental health services.
That's a really good point, and I didn't think about it that way, right? Like the pastor is the part of the support,
Yeah.
part of your community, but not the provider of the mental
Yeah.
health there. Um,
Absolutely.
so for people who, because we're joking about it earlier, right? Like who do you know
Hmm.
who needs therapy? But
Yeah.
I think a lot of us immigrants, we like, especially our generation and the women, right? We've sought out therapy, we've seen the benefits, but
Mhm.
we have family, we have friends, maybe romantic connections, whatever,
Mhm.
people who like we want to encourage to
Yeah.
seek therapy. And I don't know, like I used to think that you could like help somebody get to that point of recognizing that they will
Yeah.
benefit, but part of me is also like, I don't know that it's an outside influence that can make somebody really realize like, okay, I need to go. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I got a lot of thoughts on it. So I don't think that we can force others to change or accept something that they're not ready for. So when I think about the change process or just like getting ready to make a subtle change in your life, there's a process that people go through, right? We call it the stages of change, right? There are people going to be in a space where they're pre-contemplative, right? They're slightly think about it, but they're not at that stage and they're not ready to take any action. And then you have somebody who's like in a action phase where they're like they know it's a problem, they're super aware and they're ready to make the necessary changes. And so we keep that in mind when we think about like our loved ones or wherever they are in their journey. However, what we can do as like family members or loved ones is like you can provide information, right? By information, you could be like, for example, my mother has really bad anxiety. My mother has struggled with anxiety my whole entire for what I've known her, as long as I've known her, 35 years. And so now I'm in a place where I can be like, Ma, you are really struggling with this anxiety. You really need to do something about it. Like it's keeping you up at night. You're having nightmares. Like this isn't sustainable for you. And so I can provide her with that psychoeducation. I can provide her with the tools, but ultimately it's going to be on her to take that step. And I have to be okay with that, right? I've done my part. I find peace in that I provided their education and I provided the basic tools. Ultimately, it's up to them to full leap, if you will, to make those the next steps of changes. And so that's unfortunate. That's a part of the process of change, and it can be frustrating. It can be hard to watch, especially when it's a loved one. The only exception to that is if they're in like full blown crisis mode, right? Like they've expressed to you they have intent to hurt themselves or other people. Then we can bring them to a crisis hospital and we can have them sectioned. That's a whole nother situation. But apart from that, like being able to provide resources or emotional support to which you have the capacity for, right? Like a lot of us can't take on a whole bunch of things because we got our own things going on, but I think we can be supportive in that way and just finding peace with that, right? Like I can't convince this person to change because if the longer you think you can do that, you're gonna just run yourself ragged because that's just not the reality of it. People change for themselves, not for other people, and they change when they're ready. And so that's just human nature.
I can definitely speak to that because I have a friend who had been encouraging me to go to therapy for a very long time. And I don't remember how we got to this point, but I probably called her once in the middle of the night crying.
Mm.
And in the dead of the night, she knew me to a point where she could answer all the questions on my behalf with EAP. And that night, she called EAP and got me an
Oh, wow.
appointment. And so I might have gone then, but I did not actively invest in the process at that time. And for years and years, she just kept nudging with it. And she's like, would you rather
Mm.
I don't talk about this? And I'm like, no, go ahead. And so she would always nudge. And I always tell her that I talk about her maybe every therapy session just because I recognize how much work she put into doing that. And it could also have been there are two things. A lot of people use their friends as their therapists without
Yeah.
even asking like how much bandwidth. Something I've learned lately is to ask like how
Yeah.
much bandwidth do you have? Because we just dump on our friends and dump and dump and dump when they're also going through something
Mm-hmm.
and they're trying to be there for us the best way that they can. But sometimes people snap and you'll be surprised why your friend ghosted you. It's just you got too much going on.
Yeah, no, I tell my friends all the time, like if I had a long day, I just don't have the capacity or the bandwidth, right? And now I'm married, I still don't even have the capacity sometimes, and I just like gotta communicate that, like let's check in first, see what I have the bandwidth to do, and then we can kind of take it from there. If I don't have it, I don't have it, and I'm not gonna push myself because I've been burnt out, I've been depressed, and I'm not going back down that path, and I know what works for me, and so you're gonna have to respect that hard line that I'm gonna have to draw.
We've talked about this on the show before, right? So, like, can you give me an example of how, like, you would communicate that to your friend in real life? Because I'm like,
Yeah.
how do you say that? Whether it's in a text, I mean, I'm a
Yeah.
texter, so
So, for example, I have a friend, like one of my really good friends. I live here in Georgia now. She lives down the street from me. We went to high school together. She has kids, and sometimes she likes to talk about her kid's father and the problems that he's giving her. Like, and I get it. And there are times where like I have the capacity to handle it, and I'm just going with the flow. But there are times that I don't, and I'm just like, hey, Jessica, I've had a really long day at work. You I just don't have it in me right now. Can we put a pause on this? Let's make a plan to meet this weekend, play tennis, and we can talk about it then. But right now, it's just not the time. And so I think that's a respectful way to just like, hey, if you're my friend, you understand, like, busy day at work, nothing personal. I just don't got it for me right now.
Okay.
I mean, I'm
So don't
direct
ignore
with it.
so don't ignore them. That's not the
No,
answer.
Don't ignore it.
no.
No, no. That's a passive way of handling the situation. Your friends deserve more than that.
I have
Okay.
another question. So I have
Go
my
for
other
it.
question would be, because we talked about having a name for certain things. I
Mm-hmm.
find that in a lot of immigrants, there's a fear of like labels, right? It's
Mm,
you depression is like, God forbid you're not depressed. Or or
yep.
Yep.
anxiety. Like, I think that it helps to put a name to these things. And I was saying
Yeah.
like more and more. So before, my therapist was like, yeah, you have anxiety. I would like watch these videos on Instagram. I'm like, oh, that sounds like me. But I think that
See myself.
even with as much as like, nah, that can be me. So I always, my cop out would say I have anxious tendencies. I would not say
Mm-hmm.
that. I have anxiety. And then take it a step further, like when we go to therapy and it's like medication, me.
Mm.
I was like, the thought of getting a medication is as enlightened as I think that I am. It's something that I
Okay.
worry about so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of people experience the same thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so like what advice would you give to people in that situation?
Yeah, so I think first the part about medication, I don't, so what I tell my clients is that you don't have to do medications if that's not what you want to do. However, depending on the severity of symptoms and depending what the diagnosis is, sometimes we know that the literature says that medication, psychotropic medication with talk therapy is the most effective treatment method for XYZ diagnosis. And so with that, I encourage clients to ask tons of, so I don't prescribe because I'm not a prescriber, but if that's something that the path that you want to go want to go down, like what are your concerns? What are your worries? What are your fears? What's coming up for you? Let's explore some of that stuff that's coming up for you that may be serving as a potential barrier to getting to that point. And also in regards to just like the names and the labels, now, again, I think it's also an opportunity to explore what comes with that name, what comes with that label, what do you expect, what are things going to change, and so there could be some fears, there could be some underlying stuff that is kind of you may be sitting with, and so there's an opportunity to explore that within the therapeutic space, but also okay if it isn't appropriate for you or it doesn't feel like you want to put a label on it, depending if you're using insurance or not, we don't have to. Sometimes it's just about providing the psychoeducation around what this experience is, and we don't have to put that formalized diagnosis, right? Because we know there are some careers that can be hindered with a diagnosis of like bipolar or depression, right? Being a police officer or army or something like that. And so I tell people as well, like part of the advantage of not using insurance is that you don't have to be labeled with any diagnosis. A lot of people don't know that when you use an insurance company, you have to be diagnosed. They because they use the medical model, right? There has to be a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of take it from that standpoint. But also, I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of fears, there's a lot of preconceived notions around things. And so there's an opportunity to explore that together with your client and validate it, right? It's a real fear, it's a legitimate concern. But also, there may be an opportunity to educate the client around some of these fears or some of the stuff that they're holding on to regarding the diagnosis or whether it's medication. So it really depends on where you're at and what is sort of the presentation.
Got it. So you just mentioned insurance, right? Which leads me to
Mhm.
my next topic.
Yes.
In America, at least, that's the only place I can speak for. Healthcare in general, right, is cost prohibitive
Terrible.
for a lot of people, right? People, I mean, even if people want to seek out mental health care, costs sometimes, or at least the perception, because it's not
Mhm.
always the case, they don't always know the resources available to them, but the
Yeah.
perception that it's an expensive thing to have access to, it's like, oh, I simply cannot afford that. They kind of treat it like it's a luxury, essentially. Like,
Mm.
I can't, right? So
Mm.
it is what it is. We live in America. Do
Yeah.
you have advice for people who that might be a concern, right? Seeking out affordable or accessible mental health services.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of things or a couple of avenues we can go. The first thing that I'm gonna recommend, like especially if cost is a factor, it's the local community health centers. So like the community health centers that have the federally qualified community health status or designation. So they were designed to address medical and healthcare needs in communities that were underserved. And so they're literally designed to address the gaps or address the people that slip through the cracks because the medical, medical world here in the United States can be so inaccessible for people. So because they are federally qualified medical centers, they provide low, if not free, healthcare services. And so part of that designation also requires them to have a behavioral health professional on board. And so behavioral health is synonymous with mental health providers. What happens is oftentimes people come into their primary care offices and what they're experiencing are things like anxiety or depression, or they're somaticizing. So they're experiencing physical symptoms as a result of neglecting their mental health. And so we understood that. And so this rolled out, I was in grad school, like 2011, we rolled it out in Boston at one of the clinics. And so they're fully embedded in most of the community health centers in across the country. And so one of the ways to find them is just like Google community health center near me. And so you'll probably, a list can pop up. I think you could also go on fqac.gov or .org or something like that. And you could also type in your zip code and kind of find centers in your area. So again, they will provide you sort of brief short-term mental health support services, and that is either low cost or free depending on your income, right? And so you should be prepared to verify your income going into there so that they can set you up. You know, when I was in California for a few years, they had a program called FPAC, Family Planning Act. And so when folks came in and who didn't have insurance, or they were underinsured, they were able to get this money from this funding through FPAC to get access to healthcare services, including mental health. So that's one way. The other thing that's also an opportunity if you are sort of low income, if you have your insurance, right? Call your insurance. They all have behavioral health products or behavioral health lines. And so with that, you call them and let them know that, hey, I need a provider. Do you have specifications on what your provider should be? Should your provider be a Black woman who's trained in EMDR or some trauma therapy intervention? And so you let them know what that is. And so they'll filter through their system and they'll generate a list based on what your qualifications are for this therapist. And so that way you get all in-network providers. So your in-network providers are in-network with your insurance, so you don't have to worry about any, weird deductible, well, depending on your plan type, any concerns about deductibles or any outrageous fees, right? They should be in-network with your provider, so you pay your standard copay if you have one. And so the other opportunity is two more. The other thing I would say is if you have the HSA or FSA benefit through your employer, right? These are the pre-tax funds that you already put aside into this health spending card, and so that is something that you could use for therapy, right? And so that you could just give your therapist. Most therapists know how to process those cards at this point, and so that could cover the cost of therapy. And then finally, if you're really struggling, there are some therapists that do pro bono work, right? I work right now with I have two pro bono cases that I work with because I understand like it's just complicated and they just don't have the money, and so I want to be of support to them ongoingly. And so there's the opportunity to do a sliding fee scale as well, right? So like some therapists will base a sliding fee scale based on the federal poverty line. And so based on that number, they can determine how much you can pay. And so I was seeing somebody for as low as $20 a week because that's just what she could afford on a $30,000 salary. And so there are a number of ways to kind of navigate it. You just got to know about it really. And so be prepared to ask. Like I always tell people, the worst thing anybody can say is no.
Yeah.
If you don't ask, you'll never know.
Yeah.
Another
And
one that I forgot that I've used is using your employee assistance program.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. EAP.
Where the lady was very kind to let me know that they cover six sessions per issue. So you could do the first six could be for anxiety, The
Mm-hmm.
next 6 could be for for
Depression.
depression.
Yep.
If you want to do couples therapy, then you get 6, your partner gets 6, so that's 12. And so that is something I lean into heavily.
That's a good one. EAP is definitely a great resource, and it's free.
Definitely. I've used it for sure. So, can you talk about like the importance of having, you mentioned it earlier, culturally competent, therapists? What does that mean and why is it important?
Yeah, so, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I was talking to my supervisor, and she was telling me this story where, like, a Puerto Rican man was in a hospital, and nobody could understand him in terms of the way his dialect, the way he was talking. And so they took it as him saying that he was threatening to hurt himself. So as a result, he was sectioned, right? So that is the highlight of like a lack of culturally competence care. Culturally competence means that you understand that these people that you're serving come from diverse backgrounds, and it's not necessary that we have to be the expert in this person's background, but we need to be patient and willing enough to first understand, provide them the tools to make sure that they have access to sort of receiving information, right? By virtue of translation or translator services, right? Or making sure that the documentation that we're handing out in the clinic is they can read it, right? They have access to the information and health literacy because of the information being provided in their language. It's about making sure that they feel safe and they feel respected. And so keeping in consideration all the elements that embody culture, an individual's culture, and being mindful of that in the space that I'm building. And so, with that example alone, the providers missed the mark on so many levels. And so as a culturally competent provider, I may not be the expert in your culture or your background, but I'm going to be patient to understand. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to engage you. I'm going to ask you if you understand what I'm saying. Do I need to bring an interpreter in? And so that is a way to make sure that we can prevent sort of outcomes like the example that I provided. So culturally competent is so important because even as an African and Haitian woman, like there are things like mannerisms, right? Like the other day, somebody tried to shake somebody's hand with the left. I'm just like, you can't do that. That's a sign of disrespect. And so that where if I wasn't attuned to that, I would have missed, like I wouldn't have picked that up. And so it's just being able to support the person and feeling safe and respected in the care that they're getting.
And an example I heard, this was on TikTok, I think it was like an Indian person was saying that they were talking to their therapist who I think was a white American about like their relationship with their parents. And kind of the advice that this therapist was giving was to set boundaries in a way that just was not culturally possible. Now, I will acknowledge that in certain communities like ours, there is a need for establishing boundaries with elders, but there's the way that a white person might be able to do it with their parents is not how. So I think it also comes into the advice, right? You can't just tell like an African, like, tell her no and put your foot down. You know what I mean? Like, it's
cut off your parents and never talk to them for the rest of your life. It's not applicable to us. So that's cultural competency, right? I know not to say those things because it just doesn't make sense for us. Or I have somebody that's a firstborn daughter to her parents, and so the layers that comes with, right? Most people won't get it, but I get it, right? And so that's cultural competency, and people need that, right? Like, how else are we going to build that connection? How else are you going to feel safe in this space that we're providing here? Or how else are you going to be able to feel like you can confide in me if I don't get you, right? And so that's cultural competency.
So you mentioned people who are seeking asylum, right? And it reminded me because we had on a previous show, we had Daniel Susan, who does advocacy work for Cameroonian immigrants, and he talked about some of the journeys that people take, to come to the US. And of course, it's extremely traumatizing. And I feel like people just come to America and it's like, okay, I need to focus on getting my documents in order. They get the documents in order. I need to work. And it's that trauma that they experienced on the journey and through the process, like the whole stress and anxiety. I feel like that's not even, it's not addressed. So I'm so glad to hear that that's something that you are addressing, right, specifically with your clients. Can you just talk about why that's important and how that trauma can really like shape people's
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the value or the importance around it is just to support people. Part of it is that it's supporting people in compiling their paperwork and putting their case together, but also it's providing a space and opportunity for them to provide get that psychoeducation. Because imagine you coming in from the border, coming in from other culture, coming into the United States, and like never necessarily had a name around that experience, or perhaps unfortunately those behaviors were normalized because of whatever environment that you were coming in from. And so to be able to have this space where you can kind of first identify what that experience was for yourself, also knowing that that wasn't okay and that wasn't something that you deserve to, because a lot of blame and shame happens when with victims of trauma. And so providing that opportunity for them to understand like that's not okay what happened to you and it wasn't your fault. And so, but also for those who are willing to do the long term work, because unfortunately what I do see what happens in immigration cases is that people, they want their evaluation, their mental health assessment so they can keep up and go get their lawyer and file for their case and never necessarily come back for the ongoing mental health services. So for those, they understand that they have access to this support ongoingly if that's something that they continue or desire to continue working through. And so for a lot of people, I have a few people that come back for ongoing therapy. And, for some people, it's the first time they've ever kind of had a space where they can kind of sit with some of this stuff and understand like the wrongdoings that took place and also how it's impacted them. And just again, talking about identifying emotions and identifying feelings. It's the first time they've ever been able to do that. And so it really is like a really paramount opportunity for them in so many ways. And so along with just helping them build their cases, but also helping them in terms of like getting access to mental health for the first time, it's really, really important. And it's part of the reason why I got into this work.
So, what are some changes that you would hope to see in immigrant communities and how we approach mental health, and like what can we as, members of that community do to bring about those positive changes?
I think our generation is doing a really good job. I think this awareness by having these open dialogues and conversations are really important in terms of like moving things forward in the community as it relates to mental health. I think being receptive or how about this, creating environments for the little ones that are coming up, the next generation, creating spaces and opportunities for them to normalize this idea that, sometimes I am going to feel sad, sometimes maybe I feel anxious, and not to reprimand them, not to shame them, not to like force them into reclusion, but to create an opportunity for open communication and dialogue within the households is going to be really important as well. And I don't know about y'all, but growing up, the only way that I could miss school is if I was like bleeding or like needed to be like sent to the hospital, right? And so sometimes we have kids that are experiencing legitimate anxiety around something. Maybe it's bullying at school and they can't articulate that, right? And if we're reprimanding them or we're forcing the shame or stigma on them, they're not going to feel safe to open up around these type of things. And so as a culture, as a community, I think we need to create more spaces where we can have open dialogue without reprimanding kids or reprimanding young adults about or pushing back against some of this idea around sickness. And if it only equates to bleeding or being, transported to the hospital immediately, we have to keep an open idea around what that means to not be okay. And so I think it starts there, starts in the home, and, then we can build the healthier practices later on.
You just made me think of a conversation I was having the other day, right? Because you talked about like, kids being able to stay home if they're just mentally, having a mental health day. And I think that it translates into our adulthood, because I was telling somebody the other day that I don't take mental health days at work. Like I have sick days. You should be using your sick days when you're having a bad mental health day, but I never do, right? And so I have these sick days that I end up not using, because if it's been a year where I just really, I think physically get sick, even if I'm having a bad mental health day, especially because now I can work from home on some days, I'll just be like, okay, I don't feel like seeing people. I don't want to go into the office. I'm really depressed today. I'll just work from home, instead of saying, hey team, I'm not feeling good today, I'm going to take a sick day. So I feel
Yeah.
like that attitude of, oh, I'm not physically sick, so I cannot
Yeah.
take a day
Yeah.
off, I can't take a sick day, that it goes from child to adulthood. So yeah, we should definitely be
Absolutely.
training the young ones that it's okay.
Or this idea that we have to continue pushing and pushing through and pushing through, being strong, being tough, and that doesn't allow us to be sort of vulnerable. That doesn't allow us to just be. Like, I don't think we, like, for me, when I think about my childhood, there was no such thing as just relaxing. It was just kind of like, go, go, go. You need to be doing something, extracurricular activities, sports, this, that, like, internship with the government, this, that. Like, it's just, there's no this idea of like relaxing as a woman, as a black woman. It's just like it's unheard of. And so for me now at 35, I'm chilling. Like today, I didn't see anybody. Like I was reading a book, I went to a cafe. Like that's unheard of, but like that's my life right now, and I love it, and I'm embracing it. But it took me a while to get here to just acknowledge that I'm deserving of this. Like there's nothing wrong with this. Like this doesn't make me lazy, right? Lazy is a term we love to throw around, but like this is just me like taking care of myself, replenishing myself, and that is okay.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about it, I think, on the podcast before. This idea of self care, right? I feel like sometimes
Hmm.
we do this thing where, okay, I'm doing my self care day. That self care
Hmm.
day, it ends up with you spending money because you think that to
Correct.
take care of yourself, oh, I have to go to a spa, I
Yeah.
have to go and get my nails done, I have to, which is fine. That's
Yeah.
sure, it's a form of but self care is also just sitting on your couch and not doing anything. But,
Correct. Or going for a walk costs you
mm-hmm,
nothing, right? For
mm-hmm,
me, that's my thing. I like to make sure I'm moving my body and it feels great. I feel great. I feel better about myself. I feel more focused. And so that's self care for me. It doesn't always have to be spending tons of money all the time.
yeah.
You guys are saying this, and I keep laughing because I remember I love my grandmother, but at my grandmother's house, it was we found ways to look busy.
Mm, yeah.
Because like you could have been doing something for an hour, 30 minutes, and then you stopped to rest, and that was the moment she showed up and said, "What are you doing?" And
Yeah.
so it's this whole thing of like always trying to look busy. And like you said, we carry it into adulthood because we've been playing this role. And like there's nobody
Yeah.
watching you, nobody's looking over your shoulder. But even when you sit down to just rest and do nothing, I'm constantly thinking, well, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, or I should. I'm just like, listen, nobody's going to die. We're all
Yeah.
going to be all right. And we're going to sit here and I'm going to rest,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
But
I
it's not something
remember.
that comes naturally.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first time I went to Cameroon. My sister and I were with my dad, and we got to the house. We were sitting on the couch. The look on everybody's faces of us just sitting down and relaxing was just like how dare you? Like how just be sitting down, not in the kitchen. I'm just like, all right, like, but yeah, no, we're pushing back. We're changing the narrative.
You said
Amen.
that, yes. It's like you go to somebody's house for a party. You're a guest. And people
No,
are
they don't want
judging you
you.
for like sitting on the couch. And I'm guilty of this. Like 10 years ago, we're having my daughter's christening, and naturally, all the women moved into the kitchen except this one girl. But like I didn't know her like that, but we are all in the kitchen like, look at her sitting there. Like she's a guest. Did she come here to be helping us chop onions or like fry? Like she came to this party because we didn't have that smoke for the guys. Like nobody was looking at
True.
them, like just
Nope.
sitting there. But we were all in the kitchen. And so it took me a while to be like, listen, I can go to a party and leave. I don't have to help clean up. I'm sorry, I'm a guest.
Correct.
Um
Bruh. There's the
Correct.
cleanup part. Listen,
Correct.
cleaning up after a
Give it
party,
to the
that shit
team.
is exhausting.
like
Tell me
why am
about
I
it.
doing this now? This day I was just like I did my time in my late teens, my early 20s. I cleaned up a whole lot of parties in Houston. I've retired.
Yeah. Yes. 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 No. Seriously.
So, and then what's next for you? Your
I would love to be retired by 45. Um,
Yeah.
but what is next for my career? I don't really know. I feel like I've been able to do a lot. Part of me thinks I should go back to school, but I won't do it unless it's free. So I don't really
or
know.
that?
Yeah, no more student debt for me like
Mm-mm.
that.
Mm-mm.
No, 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 no. I don't really know. I know I'm getting a little tired from like the one-to-one space. So like I've been slowly pivoting into like the corporate wellness space, so helping organizations design and sustain, psychologically safe spaces for people within the work environment. Just so that they're able to retain talent, and also people want to stay in these organizations, right? When people invest in their people, people want to stay, people are happy. Helping organizations see the priority within that. So pivoting a little bit into that space and kind of just whatever comes my way.
Okay. Are you still taking new clients for support?
I am not, but we have a team of 4 other providers that are absolutely seeing clients right now. And so, if anybody is in need, you're in California, you're in Georgia, you're in Massachusetts, you're in Texas, you're in Florida, you're in Connecticut, we're happy to help you.
And where can they find you? What's your website or any social media?
Yes. So the website is www.awesupportservices.com, and I'm on all platforms at Anim Aweh.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And just a reminder for our listeners that our August book of the month is Butter Honey Pig Bread. That's a mouthful.
Pig bread. All right.
It's supposed to be really good, according to the TikTok girlies. So
It is good.
Yeah, you've read
Okay.
it?
I've read it. I remember absolutely nothing.
Let me go get it now on Libby.
There you go. And listeners, viewers, you can subscribe to our channel on YouTube at 2Bs in a Pod and on Instagram at 2Bs Pod. And until next time,
When hand derob food, food to derob hand. Literal translation: when the hand is rubbing on the foot is also rubbing on the hand. I think this is something about support, like helping each other.
yeah,
Yeah, like you're rubbing the foot, but you could be helping somebody and they're also helping you, right?
yeah, give and take, right? And I don't know, in this context, I thought of it in terms of emotional support. I mean, we're saying earlier how, it can be draining, right, to give.
Yeah.
But in terms of being in community with somebody who needs support, in a way, you're also getting support back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
So
absolutely. I mean, that's the community is so important, and one of the things that I value so much in terms of like being Cameroonian, being African, is that we are community minded. Like, growing up, like I had my brothers, my cousins, we all grew up close, right? It was very much a community. Or even this past weekend, we had a celebration for my dad turning 80, and so like we did that together as a community. Or even having my traditional wedding, and just like the community mind coming into it, right? You're coming in, marrying into the family, and so it's like a family exchange. And so as humans, we're not meant to be alone. We need people. We thrive off that. And so when I see people push back on this idea like, oh, I don't need anybody, I'm like, you actually do, right? If you're alone, depressed, you're probably going to feel that depression a little more amplified. You're going to probably experience that anxiety a little more. You need people.
absolutely. Congrats on your
100%.
wedding.
Thank you. I'm so glad it's over. My God.
I can imagine. All right. So if there's one or two things you would want listeners, viewers to take away from this episode, can you just summarize?
Yes, that one, it's okay not to be okay, right? That's not a defect. That doesn't mean God doesn't love you. That doesn't mean you're flawed. Like, we go through things in life. And number two, like, get help, right? You figure out what the help is that you need. Do you need to speak to your primary care physician? Do you need to speak to the therapist? Do you need to speak to the pastor, a life coach? All these type of supports look differently based on what it is that you need. But like first getting to this place where we can identify like, I'm not okay, things are changing, I need support. And getting help isn't a sign of weakness, despite whatever you've been told.
Yes, the last part is very important. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Anim, for joining
Right.
us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.